The sun hung like a cruel copper coin above Dust Devil Gulch, pressing down on the alley behind the general store. 10-year-old Elara Vance huddled there, a small, forgotten shadow against the peeling paint of the wall. Her tattered dress, once perhaps blue, now seemed the color of the dust that coated everything. She clutched a worn wooden doll to her chest, its single remaining arm smoothed by endless anxious touches, its faded painted eyes staring blankly at nothing. A faint, sweet scent, warm and yeasty, drifted to her from the back of the store, a torment wrapped in a promise. Alara swallowed hard, her throat dry, a rasping sound from deep inside. Her stomach, a hollow drum, performed a low, constant rumble, a familiar song of emptiness. Every breath was a conscious effort. Every muscle ached with the fatigue that only long-term hunger could bring. Her gaunt face, usually streaked with dirt, now also bore the faint tracks of dried tears, indistinguishable from the dust. Her lips were cracked and bleeding at the corners, testament to the relentless dryness in the air and the lack of moisture in her body. She watched the back window of the general store, a small, grimy pane framed by splintered wood. Inside, the blurry figure of Martha Higgins, the store owner, moved with brisk efficiency. Martha's stout frame was a familiar sight, her severe bun and pursed lips a constant, unchanging fixture of the town. Alara knew Martha never missed a trick, her sharp eyes always seeming to find the smallest flaw, the most insignificant transgression. Now Martha was arranging loaves of fresh bread in the front display, each one golden brown and impossibly perfect. The sight was a searing pain in Alara's eyes, a cruel taunt. She could almost taste the crust, feel its slight resistance, then the soft, warm interior melting on her tongue. The thought made her stomach contract violently. Her wooden doll, her only constant companion since her father disappeared, felt solid and real in her trembling hands. She had named the doll Hope, a small, desperate prayer whispered into its unmoving face each night. Hope's missing arm was a constant reminder of things lost, of a past that felt increasingly distant and dreamlike. Ilara remembered her father carving hope for her, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he shaped the wood. He had promised to come back, to find them a place where the sun did not burn quite so hard and the dust did not cling quite so relentlessly. That was a year ago. The promise felt like another empty space inside her now, just like her stomach. The sounds of Dust Devil Gulch were muted here in the alley, a distant creak of a wagon wheel, the lowing of cattle from the livery, the faint, tinny piano music from the saloon. None of it felt real, none of it connected to her small, isolated world of hunger and desperation. She pressed her cheek against the rough wood of the doll, seeking comfort from its unyielding surface. A wave of dizziness washed over her, making the alley walls swim before her eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for it to pass, for the world to settle once more. When she opened them again, the bread was still there, still a torment, still utterly out of reach. A fly buzzed lazily around her head, an annoying, persistent drone. Alara was too weak to shoo it away, too weary to even lift her hand. Her arms felt like lead, her legs like brittle sticks beneath her. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, only a few scraps, a hardened piece of jerky found by the side of the road, a half-eaten apple core someone had discarded. Each meager find felt like a miracle, a brief stay against the encroaching darkness. But now, even those small mercies had ceased. The town had grown tired of her, she knew. They saw her as a nuisance, a shadow that reminded them of something unpleasant. Her father had once told her that people in towns like this could be hard, but never truly cruel. He said they had their own struggles, their own reasons for keeping their guard up. He had told her stories of his travels, of generous strangers and unexpected kindness. But Alara had found little of that kindness in Dust Devil Gulch. Each door she approached had remained shut. Each face she met had turned away. Each plea she whispered had been met with cold indifference. The memory of Mrs. Henderson, the seamstress, chasing her away with a broom just yesterday, still stung. "Go on, you pest," Mrs. Henderson had yelled, her voice sharp as a needle. "There's no charity here for the likes of you." The scent of the bread, now mingling with the faint smell of something fried from the saloon, was becoming unbearable. It twisted her insides, not just with hunger, but with a deep, aching longing for warmth, for safety, for a world where she wasn't always cold and afraid. She imagined wrapping her small hands around a warm loaf, pulling off a piece, feeling the steam rise. She pictured sitting by a fire, the bread hot in her mouth, her father smiling at her from across the room. The image was so vivid, so real, that a single hot tear finally escaped her eye, tracing a clean path down her dusty cheek. She wiped it away quickly with the back of her hand, ashamed of the weakness. Tears wouldn't fill her belly. She looked at Hope, the wooden doll. "What do you think, Hope?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a dry rustle in her throat. "Should I try again?" The doll, of course, offered no answer, its painted eyes fixed and unwavering. But just speaking the words aloud, giving voice to the terrifying thought, seemed to lend her a fragile sliver of courage. The thought of staying here, of fading into nothingness in this dusty alley, was worse than the fear of another rejection. She had to try. She had to. With a monumental effort, Alara pushed herself up from the ground. Her muscles screamed in protest, her head swam, and for a moment she thought she might fall. She leaned heavily against the wall, taking slow, shallow breaths, waiting for the dizziness to recede. Each step felt like lifting boulders. Her legs trembled, threatening to buckle beneath her. Her tattered boots scuffed against the gritty earth, raising small clouds of dust with every shuffle. The back door of the general store, a faded green and scarred with countless nicks and scratches, seemed miles away. As she shuffled closer, the tantalizing aroma of the bread grew stronger, overwhelming her senses, dulling the metallic taste of hunger in her mouth. She could hear the faint clatter of pans from inside, the murmur of Martha Higgins humming a tuneless melody. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Fear, cold and sharp, mingled with the desperate, burning need. What if Martha yelled at her again? What if she threw water on her, like old man Peterson had done last week? The humiliation still burned. But what was humiliation compared to this gnawing emptiness? She reached the back door, her small hand hovering uncertainly over the rough wood. It felt ancient, heavy, a barrier between her and sustenance. She took another deep, shaky breath, the dry air scratching her lungs. Her fingers curled around the worn wooden doll, drawing comfort from its familiar shape. She knew she had to speak, to make a sound, to make herself seen. Even if it meant facing Martha Higgins's icy glare and sharp words, it was a chance, however slim. She knocked, a faint, timid rap, so soft she wasn't sure it had even been heard over the clatter inside. She waited, holding her breath, listening to the frantic beat of her own heart. Nothing. Martha continued to hum. Alara swallowed, her mouth like sandpaper. She tried again, a little louder this time, her knuckles aching against the door. This time the humming stopped. A sudden tense silence fell, broken only by Alara's ragged breathing. Then the door wrenched open with an abruptness that made Alara flinch back. Martha Higgins stood there, her face a mask of irritation, her severe eyes narrowing as they landed on Alara. Martha's apron was dusted with flour, her hands on her hips, a posture of immediate disapproval. "What do you want, girl?" Martha asked, her voice a harsh, impatient rasp. Her gaze swept over Alara's tattered clothes, her gaunt frame, then landed on the wooden doll as if seeing an additional, unnecessary burden. Alara's voice, when it finally came, was a barely audible whisper, thin and reedy. "Please, ma'am," she began, her eyes fixed on Martha's scuffed boots, unable to meet the woman's angry gaze. "I haven't eaten in a long time. Do you have any crusts? Anything you might be throwing away?" The words tumbled out, laced with a plea that felt like a lifetime of hope and despair. She braced herself for the inevitable rejection, the familiar sting. Martha Higgins merely stared at her for a long, silent moment, her expression unchanging, unsoftening. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the distant sounds of the town and Alara's own shallow breaths. Then Martha's lips tightened, pursing into a thin, grim line. Her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, flickered with something akin to disgust. She took a half step back, a gesture of physical recoil. "We've nothing for beggars," Martha stated, her voice sharp as breaking glass, cutting through the silence. She then slammed the back door shut with a thunderous bang, the sound echoing through the alley, leaving Alara to face the empty alley once more. The empty alley felt colder than the open street, even beneath the relentless sun. Alara clutched her worn wooden doll, its faded dress a mirror of her own tattered clothes. Martha Higgins's words still echoed in her ears, sharp and dismissive, a fresh wound added to the constant dull ache in her stomach. Every step away from the general store felt like a defeat, each breath a struggle against the dizziness that threatened to pull her down into the dirt. The street stretched before her, wishing and unforgiving, the dust motes dancing in the harsh light, seeming to mock her fading strength. Her gaze drifted down the row of weathered buildings, past the blacksmith's shop where the clang of hammer on anvil once offered a brief, jarring distraction from her hunger. Today, even that familiar noise felt distant, like a memory filtered through a thick fog. Her throat was raw, parched, a desert inside her body. She imagined the cool, clear water that must be inside the saloon, but water would not fill the gnawing void. Food was what she needed, just a morsel, anything to quiet the relentless clamor in her belly. A gust of wind whipped through the street, carrying with it the faint, intoxicating scent of something fried, perhaps bacon, or maybe just wishful thinking. It made her stomach cramp, a sharp, unpleasant twist that left her gasping. She leaned against a rough wooden post, the splinters digging into her thin arm, but she barely registered the discomfort. Her eyes were fixed on the saloon's swinging doors, a dark rectangle of mystery and noise down the street. From inside, a cacophony spilled out. Loud, boisterous laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of men's voices, punctuated by an occasional shout. It was a world entirely separate from her quiet, starving existence. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, the sun a burning orange behind her eyelids. When she opened them again, the saloon still loomed, a beacon of activity in the otherwise sleepy, sun-baked town. She knew what lay beyond those doors. Men, rough and loud, often drunk, but sometimes, just sometimes, a little more generous than the women who ran the stores. Hope, a fragile, persistent thing, flickered weakly within her. It was a desperate hope, born of pure need, but it was there nonetheless. This might be her last chance today. The thought was a cold stone in her chest. Each step towards the saloon was an act of immense will. Her legs felt heavy, like lead, and her worn boots stirred up tiny clouds of dust with every shuffle. The sounds from the saloon grew louder, the music of a piano now discernible, a lively, slightly off-key tune that seemed to mock the solemn rhythm of her own labored breathing. She could smell the stale beer now, a bitter, yeasty aroma that mingled with the sharp tang of cheap whiskey and the undeniable scent of sawdust. It was not a comforting smell, but it was a smell of life, of people, and people might have food. She reached the saloon, the swinging doors looming taller than she remembered, dark woods scarred by countless pushes and shoves. She hesitated, her small hand tightening around her doll. Fear was a cold knot in her throat, making it even harder to swallow. What if they were like Martha? What if they just laughed at her? The thought was almost enough to turn her back, to send her retreating to the shadows of the alley once more. But the hunger was a far stronger master. It clawed at her insides, a persistent, relentless beast that demanded to be fed. With a deep, shaky breath, Alara pushed one of the swinging doors just enough to create a narrow gap. A sliver of the saloon's interior became visible, a blur of dim light, moving figures, and swirling pipe smoke. The sudden blast of noise and warmth startled her, making her flinch back slightly. Her eyes, wide and searching, darted through the gloom, trying to make sense of the chaotic scene. She saw men huddled at tables, cards in their hands, their faces grim or triumphant. Others stood at the long wooden bar, their backs to her, their voices booming. Her gaze finally settled on a burly man standing near the entrance, his back to the wall, nursing a glass of dark liquid. He wore a heavy, sweat-stained shirt, and his broad shoulders seemed to fill the space around him. A thick, dark beard framed a weathered face, and his eyes, though narrowed in thought, held a certain intensity. He looked like a man who worked hard, a man who might understand what it meant to be truly hungry. Perhaps he was a prospector or a ranch hand, someone who knew the harshness of the land. He shifted, and his eyes, dark and surprisingly direct, met hers. For a fleeting moment, Alara felt a spark of something akin to recognition in his gaze. Or perhaps it was just the hope within her inventing it. He didn't immediately scowl or turn away. That in itself felt like a small victory. This was her moment. This was her chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic little bird trapped in a cage. Her mouth felt like it was full of cotton, but she had to speak. She had to. Gathering every ounce of her dwindling courage, Ilara pushed the door open a fraction wider, just enough to step timidly inside. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, stale beer, and something else, something vaguely metallic, like blood or rust. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, thin and reedy against the booming backdrop of the saloon's noise. She had to force the words out, each one a tremendous effort. She looked directly at the burly prospector, her blue eyes, wide and haunted, pleading with him. "Please, sir," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "Anything. A bite?" She extended her free hand slightly, an unconscious gesture of supplication. Her tattered clothes and emaciated frame, a stark testament to her desperation. She held her breath, waiting, her entire being focused on his response. The clinking of glasses, the raucous laughter, the distant piano all seemed to fade, replaced by the frantic beating of her own heart. The prospector's expression, which had been unreadable, slowly shifted. A flicker of something crossed his face, not sympathy, but annoyance, perhaps even disgust. His lips curled into a sneer, a cruel line in his thick beard. His eyes hardened, losing any trace of the momentary neutrality they had held. The small, fragile flame of hope within Alara began to waver, threatened by a chilling draft of contempt. The prospector's gaze swept over her, taking in her dirt-streaked face, her tangled hair, her threadbare clothes, and the pitiful doll clutched in her hand. He saw a nuisance, an interruption to his quiet drink. A low growl rumbled in his chest before he spoke, his voice rough and laced with undisguised disdain, cutting through the saloon's din like a dull knife. "Get out of here," he scoffed, his words harsh and dismissive. "You little rat." Before Alara could even process the cruelty of his words, before she could flinch or retreat, his large hand shot out. It connected with her shoulder, not a gentle push, but a deliberate, forceful shove. The impact sent a shockwave through her weakened body. Her feet, already unsteady, lost their purchase on the sawdust-covered floor. The world spun, a dizzying blur of dark wood and dim light. She cried out, a small, choked sound swallowed by the saloon's noise, as her body went limp. Her worn wooden doll slipped from her grasp, falling silently to the floor. Alara tumbled backward through the swinging doors, a pathetic heap of bone and threadbare cloth, landing with a jarring thud on the hard, dusty street outside. The prospector's cruel shove sent Alara tumbling, a fresh wave of pain blossoming across her small body. Her head struck the packed earth with a dull thud, and for a moment, the world spun in a dizzying haze of dust and agony. A sharp, stinging sensation bloomed on her elbow, where it scraped against a jagged stone. She lay there, sprawled on the main street of Dust Devil Gulch, the laughter from the saloon still echoing in her ears like a cruel mockery. Each muscle screamed in protest as she slowly, painstakingly pushed herself upwards. The taste of grit filled her mouth, thick and unpleasant, a bitter companion to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Her tattered dress, already clinging to her gaunt frame, now bore another rip, a fresh testament to the town's harsh indifference. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast blue sky, beat down on her, baking the dust and stealing what little moisture remained in her parched throat. She could feel the relentless throb behind her eyes, a dull ache that had become a constant presence, a reminder of her ceaseless hunger. Her legs felt like uncertain stilts beneath her, threatening to buckle with every shaky step. She swayed, her vision flickering at the edges, a dark curtain threatening to descend. But something inside her, a stubborn spark of defiance, refused to let her fall again. Not here, not in front of these people who had already turned their backs. She could still feel the phantom weight of the prospector's hand, the brutal push that had sent her sprawling, reinforcing the terrifying lesson that asking only led to more pain. The memory of Martha Higgins's cold, hard eyes and the slamming door was a fresh wound in her mind, layering upon countless others. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, mocking her with its fleeting promise of coolness. The air was thick with the familiar, earthy smell of the dust, mingled with the faint, cloying sweetness of stale whiskey from the saloon and the distant, metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. Each scent, each sound, was a reminder of a life happening around her, a life from which she was utterly excluded. She was an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of their existence, unseen and unwanted. She dragged her worn boots through the deep, powdery dust, each step a monumental effort. Her lungs burned with the dry air, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She clutched her wooden doll tighter, its smooth, cool surface the only comfort in her burning hands. The doll, with its faded, painted eyes and missing arm, had witnessed every humiliation, every rejection, every pang of hunger. It was her silent confidant, the only one who never turned away. A desperate, primal urge to escape the accusing stares, real or imagined, pushed her forward. She couldn't bear to look at the faces behind the saloon windows, couldn't bear to hear another sneering word. She needed to disappear, to find a place where she could simply exist without being a burden, without being a target. The edge of town beckoned, a hazy promise of quiet and temporary reprieve. Her eyes, wide and haunted, darted nervously around, seeking any sign of a kinder face, a flicker of understanding, but found none. Only hardened gazes met hers, or more often, no gaze at all, as people pointedly looked away. It was as though she had become invisible, a part of the landscape, no more significant than a tumbleweed rolling down the street. The thought sent a fresh wave of despair washing over her, colder and more cutting than any physical blow. She stumbled past the general store, its windows still displaying plump loaves of bread and shiny tins, luxuries she could only dream of. The smell of fresh baked goods, usually a torture, now seemed to barely register, her senses dulled by the sheer weight of her exhaustion. Her focus was solely on putting one foot in front of the other, on reaching the distant, less crowded fringes of Dust Devil Gulch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the livery stable, a sturdy wooden structure set slightly apart from the main thoroughfare. The air here was different, heavier with the scent of hay, horses, and well-worn leather. The harsh clang of the blacksmith's hammer was fainter, replaced by the softer sounds of shuffling hooves and the occasional soft whinny. It was a quieter place, a place of animals and honest work, a place that felt a little less hostile than the rest of the town. Alara leaned against a rough-hewn fence post, its splintered wood digging into her sore arm, but she barely noticed the new discomfort. Her gaze, dull and listless moments before, suddenly sharpened, drawn by a small, unexpected scene unfolding within the stable's open archway. A man stood there, his back mostly to her, but she could see the gentle curve of his shoulders, the easy way he moved. He was a stable hand, judging by his practical clothes and the way he interacted with the animals. He had a kind face, or at least what she could glimpse of it seemed kind. His hands were calloused, but they moved with a surprising tenderness as he held something red and round. It was an apple, crisp and bright, a beacon of impossible deliciousness in her starved world. And he wasn't eating it himself. He was sharing it. He held the apple out to a large chestnut horse, whose soft muzzle nudged gently against his palm. The horse's eyes, deep and dark, seemed to regard the man with complete trust. The stable hand chuckled softly, a low, rumbling sound that carried faintly on the air, completely devoid of the harshness she had come to expect from human voices. He broke off a piece of the apple and offered it to the horse, who took it with a delicate precision, the soft crunch echoing in the sudden stillness of the stable. Ilara watched, mesmerized, a profound ache blooming in her chest, far deeper than the physical pangs of hunger. Her eyes, which had been dry for so long, suddenly welled up, blurring the edges of the scene. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, a river carving its way through a parched landscape. The simple act of kindness, extended not to her but to an animal, was almost unbearable to witness. A desperate longing, sharp and agonizing, pierced through her. She remembered apples, sweet and juicy, from a time that felt like a lifetime ago, a time when her father was still there, before the silence, before the hunger. The memory was a cruel torment, a ghost of a sensation she might never know again. The apple in the stable hand's hands seemed to shimmer, a symbol of all the warmth and nourishment that was denied to her. Her throat felt like it was closing, a dry, constricted passage that refused to obey. The words, the desperate, pleading words, formed in her mind, please, sir, just a bite, just a small piece. But they remained trapped, lodged somewhere behind the burning sensation in her esophagus. It was as if her voice, battered and bruised by so many rejections, had simply given up, retreating deep within her, unable to face another assault. Each time she had tried to speak, she had been met with scorn, with indifference, with outright cruelty. The memory of the prospector's rough hand, the sound of Martha's door slamming, the blank stares of the townsfolk, all converged into a suffocating weight. What if this kind-faced man, who was so gentle with a horse, would turn to her and scowl, calling her a nuisance? What if his soft voice would harden, telling her to get lost? The risk, the potential for another crushing blow, felt too great, too overwhelming for her already shattered spirit. She was afraid that even a whisper would shatter the fragile illusion of peace around the stable, drawing unwanted attention to her pathetic state. Her small hands tightened around her doll, her knuckles white. She wanted to be invisible. Yet paradoxically, she yearned to be seen, truly seen, not as a ragged beggar, but as a small, starving child. The conflict tore at her, a silent battle waged within her weary mind. Her stomach rumbled, a weak, pathetic protest that was drowned out by the gentle sounds of the stable. The scent of sweet hay and horse mingled with the faint, fresh aroma of the apple, a cruel tease. She imagined the crisp bite, the burst of juice, the momentary relief from the gnawing emptiness. It was a fantasy, a cruel mirage in her desert of hunger. She felt utterly drained, not just physically, but emotionally. The endless cycle of hope, however small, followed by crushing despair, had worn her down to a thin, brittle shell. To ask again, to open herself up to another potential wound, felt like an impossible task, a burden too heavy to bear. It was easier somehow to simply watch, to be a silent observer, even if it meant her stomach continued its mournful protest. A small sigh escaped her lips, barely audible, a wisp of breath lost in the vastness of the dusty air. She felt a profound loneliness, deeper than any she had ever known. The horse had a friend, a gentle hand offering sustenance. She had only her doll, and the unrelenting hunger. The injustice of it, the sheer unfairness, settled heavy in her heart, a cold, hard stone. She wished she could melt into the fence post, become one with the weathered wood, unseen and unfeeling. The need to disappear was overwhelming. She just wanted the pain to stop, the hunger to quiet its relentless roar, the burning in her eyes to subside. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, wishing to wake up somewhere else, anywhere else, where apples were plentiful and kindness was not a rare, unattainable treasure. When she opened her eyes again, the stable hand was still there, still murmuring softly to the horse, still offering pieces of the apple. He seemed completely absorbed in his task, his world small and contained, focused only on the gentle creature before him. For a moment, Alara allowed herself a tiny, forbidden sliver of hope. Perhaps if she waited long enough, if she was quiet enough, if she made herself small enough, he might notice her. He might see her. Her heart gave a weak, fluttery beat. She held her breath, every fiber of her being focused on this one slender possibility. Maybe his kindness extended beyond horses. Maybe he would see the hunger in her eyes, the tremble in her hands, the desperation in her posture. Maybe, just maybe, he would offer her a piece of that sweet red apple. Then slowly, as if sensing a shift in the air, the stable hand raised his head. His eyes, a soft, earthy brown, scanned the dusty yard, sweeping over the fence where Alara stood. For a fraction of a second, His gaze landed on her, a fleeting connection. Alara's breath hitched. A tiny spark of recognition, a glimmer of something unreadable, appeared in his eyes. But then, just as quickly it vanished. His gaze flickered away as if he had seen nothing at all, as if she were merely a trick of the light, a shadow that held no substance. He turned his attention back to the horse, stroking its mane with deliberate, careful movements. His shoulders seemed to stiffen, his posture becoming less relaxed, as if he were consciously ignoring her presence. He continued to feed the horse, but the soft murmuring had stopped. The world seemed to tilt. The spark of hope that had dared to ignite within her quickly guttered and died, leaving behind an even deeper chill. He had seen her. He had looked directly at her, and then he had chosen not to see her. It was a rejection, colder, more profound than any she had yet experienced. It was an affirmation of her worst fear. She was utterly invisible, a ghost to the living, abandoned even by the slightest flicker of human kindness. The merciless sun beat down, a blazing hammer striking the parched earth of Dust Devil Gulch. Alara stumbled, her small feet kicking up puffs of fine, hot dust with each dragging step. The world around her shimmered, wavy lines of heat rising from the ground blurring the already indistinct shapes of the distant buildings. Her head pounded with a dull, insistent rhythm, mirroring the frantic pulse in her ears. She felt like a forgotten rag doll, tossed carelessly aside. Every muscle screamed with protest, a chorus of aches and tremors that made movement an unbearable chore. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the street, not for help any longer, but for some small, shaded alcove where she might simply cease to exist for a little while. The rough cobblestones felt like jagged rocks beneath her thin, worn boots, each step a test of her failing will. A wooden water trough, splintered and green with algae, appeared before her like a mirage. It was filled with stale, murky water, likely for horses, but even the sight of it brought a fresh wave of nausea. She couldn't drink it. The thought alone turned her stomach. But its solid, unmoving bulk offered a promise of rest. Her legs, weak and unsteady, finally gave out. Alara collapsed, not gently, but with a sudden jarring impact, her shoulder slamming against the rough-hewn wood of the trough. A gasp tore from her throat, dry and ragged, burning its way up her windpipe. The smell of damp wood and the faint, acrid tang of horse manure filled her nostrils, strangely comforting in its familiarity, a grounding scent in a world that spun and tilted around her. She lay there, half propped against the trough, her chest heaving with shallow, desperate breaths. The world narrowed to the small, gritty patch of ground before her, the tiny pebbles and dust motes dancing in the fierce sunlight. Her fingers, bony and stained with grime, instinctively tightened around the worn wooden doll clutched against her chest. Its familiar, smooth surface was her only anchor. The doll, with its one missing arm and faded, painted eyes, seemed to gaze back at her, a silent, unwavering companion. She imagined it felt the same searing heat, the same crushing exhaustion. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, her voice a reedy, barely audible rustle of sound. "We're so tired, aren't we?" Her lips, cracked and bleeding, moved again, forming words only for the doll, her truest friend. "They don't see us, Lily. No one sees us." A tear, thick and hot, escaped her eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek before disappearing into the dry fabric of her tattered dress. It felt like the last drop of moisture she had left within her. The doll's small, unblinking eyes seemed to absorb her sorrow, silently bearing witness to a pain too vast for such a small body. She pressed her face against its hard, unyielding head, seeking a comfort that only existed in her own imagination. Its stillness was a balm, its quiet presence a stark contrast to the indifferent bustle of the town. A distant rumble grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath her. It was the sound of a wagon, its heavy wooden wheels grinding against the dusty road. Alara didn't even lift her head. She knew what it meant. More people, more faces that would look through her, or worse, with disdain. She had seen it 100 times already today. The rhythmic creak of the wagon's axles, the jingle of harnesses, the occasional shout of a driver. They were all sounds of a life that did not include her. She closed her eyes, wishing for the sounds to simply vanish, for the world to leave her in peace just for a moment. But the sounds grew, insistent and unavoidable. The wagon rolled past, a large, lumbering shadow briefly engulfing her before passing on. Through the thin curtain of her eyelashes, Ilara could make out figures on the wagon seat. A man, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat, held the reins. Beside him sat a woman, her dress neat and clean, a basket covered with a white cloth resting in her lap. Ilara imagined the scent of fresh baked bread, or perhaps apples wafting from it. The thought of food, any food, made her stomach clench with an agonizing spasm. Her empty belly had become a burning cavern, consuming her from the inside out. It was a hunger so profound it no longer felt like a desire, but a slow, excruciating death. No one on the wagon so much as glanced her way. Their conversation, a low murmur of voices, floated above her, unintelligible but undeniably cheerful. They were focused on their destination, on their lips, on everything that was not a small, starving girl collapsed by a trough. It was as if she were part of the landscape, another dusty rock, an inconvenient shadow. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, even more painful than her fall. She was truly invisible. The town had not just rejected her, it had erased her. A fresh wave of despair washed over her, chilling her despite the scorching heat. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, a dry boom that never fully escaped. "Lily," she whispered again, her voice fainter now. "Why don't they care?" The question hung in the hot, still air, unanswered, unheard. She squeezed the doll tighter, her knuckles white. Her head drooped further, resting against the cool, worn wood of the trough. The rough texture pressed into her temple, a slight discomfort that was almost welcome, a distraction from the larger, all-consuming pain. A wave of dizziness swept over her, making the world spin faster, colors bleeding into one another. Her body felt heavy, impossibly heavy, as if made of lead. Each beat of her heart was a struggle, a weak flutter against the walls of her chest. The air, thick with dust and heat, felt too heavy to draw into her lungs. It burned with every shallow intake. She tried to move her fingers, to shift her position, but the effort was too great. Her limbs were unresponsive, weighted down by an unseen force. A strange metallic taste coated her tongue, like old coins. It was the taste of her own failing body, a bitter farewell. A sudden shiver ran through her, an icy tremor that cut through the oppressive heat. It was a deep cold coming from within, spreading outwards from her core. Her teeth began to chatter, a tiny, almost imperceptible clicking sound in the vast silence of her personal collapse. This was it, she realized with a chilling clarity. This was what it felt like. The fighting was over. There was no more strength left to draw upon, no hidden reserve of courage. The well was dry. She was empty. Her mind, once a whirlwind of desperate thoughts and pleading prayers, began to quiet. The sharp edges of hunger, the burning sting of rejection, they all began to blur, softening into a dull, distant ache. It was a strange kind of peace born of utter exhaustion. She no longer felt the need to fight, to beg, to hope. There was only the slow, quiet surrender. Her grip on Lily, her loyal companion, loosened ever so slightly. The light around her seemed to dim, not because the sun was setting, but because her vision was failing. The edges of her sight were encroaching, a soft, fuzzy gray spreading inwards, like a curtain slowly being drawn. The vibrant yellows of the dust, the bleached whites of the buildings, the stark blues of the sky, all began to fade, losing their intensity. Her hearing, too, became muffled, the distant sounds of the town receding into an indistinct hum, like bees trapped in a jar. She could feel her eyelids growing heavier, pulling downwards, resisting her weak attempts to keep them open. The last vestiges of her awareness clung to the image of Lily, her small, unmoving face. She closed her eyes. The darkness was immediate, profound, and strangely comforting. It was a void free of pain, free of hunger, free of the judging eyes of Dust Devil Gulch. Her body slumped further against the trough, a small, lifeless form in the relentless afternoon sun. Her last conscious thought, a desperate, silent plea, was simply for an end to the pain. The merciless sun beat down, a blazing hammer striking the parched earth of Dust Devil Gulch. Alara stumbled, her small feet kicking up puffs of fine, hot dust with each dragging step. The world around her shimmered, wavy lines of heat rising from the ground, blurring the already indistinct shapes of the distant buildings. Her head pounded with a dull, insistent rhythm, mirroring the frantic pulse in her ears. She felt like a forgotten rag doll, tossed carelessly aside. Every muscle screamed with protest, a chorus of aches and tremors that made movement an unbearable chore. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the street, not for help any longer, but for some small, shaded alcove where she might simply cease to exist for a little while. The rough cobblestones felt like jagged rocks beneath her thin, worn boots, each step a test of her failing will. A wooden water trough, splintered and green with algae, appeared before her like a mirage. It was filled with stale, murky water, likely for horses, but even the sight of it brought a fresh wave of nausea. She couldn't drink it. The thought alone turned her stomach, but its solid, unmoving bulk offered a promise of rest. Her legs, weak and unsteady, finally gave out. Alara collapsed, not gently but with a sudden, jarring impact, her shoulders slamming against the rough-hewn wood of the trough. A gasp tore from her throat, dry and ragged, burning its way up her windpipe. The smell of damp wood and the faint, acrid tang of horse manure filled her nostrils, strangely comforting in its familiarity, a grounding scent in a world that spun and tilted around her. She lay there half-propped against the trough, her chest heaving with shallow, desperate breaths. The world narrowed to the small, gritty patch of ground before her, the tiny pebbles and dust motes dancing in the fierce sunlight. Her fingers, bony and stained with grime, instinctively tightened around the worn wooden doll clutched against her chest. Its familiar, smooth surface was her only anchor. The doll, with its one missing arm and faded painted eyes, seemed to gaze back at her, a silent, unwavering companion. She imagined it felt the same searing heat, the same crushing exhaustion. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, her voice a reedy, barely audible rustle of sound. "We're so tired, aren't we?" Her lips, cracked and bleeding, moved again, forming words only for the doll, her truest friend. "They don't see us, Lily. No one sees us." A tear, thick and hot, escaped her eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek before disappearing into the dry fabric of her tattered dress. It felt like the last drop of moisture she had left within her. The doll's small, unblinking eyes seemed to absorb her sorrow, silently bearing witness to a pain too vast for such a small body. She pressed her face against its hard, unyielding head, seeking a comfort that only existed in her own imagination. Its stillness was a balm, its quiet presence a stark contrast to the indifferent bustle of the town. A distant rumble grew louder, shaking the very ground beneath her. It was the sound of a wagon, its heavy wooden wheels grinding against the dusty road. Alara didn't even lift her head. She knew what it meant. More people, more faces that would look through her, or worse, with disdain. She had seen it 100 times already today. The rhythmic creak of the wagon's axles, the jingle of harnesses, the occasional shout of a driver. They were all sounds of a life that did not include her. She closed her eyes, wishing for the sounds to simply vanish, for the world to leave her in peace, just for a moment. But the sounds grew, insistent and unavoidable. The wagon rolled past, a large, lumbering shadow briefly engulfing her before passing on. Through the thin curtain of her eyelashes, Alara could make out figures on the wagon seat. A man, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat, held the reins. Beside him sat a woman, her dress neat and clean, a basket covered with a white cloth resting in her lap. Alara imagined the scent of fresh-baked bread or perhaps apples wafting from it. The thought of food, any food, made her stomach clench with an agonizing spasm. Her empty belly had become a burning cavern, consuming her from the inside out. It was a hunger so profound it no longer felt like a desire, but a slow, excruciating death. No one on the wagon so much as glanced her way. Their conversation, a low murmur of voices, floated above her, unintelligible but undeniably cheerful. They were focused on their destination, on their lives, on everything that was not a small, starving girl collapsed by a trough. It was as if she were part of the landscape, another dusty rock, an inconvenient shadow. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, even more painful than her fall. She was truly invisible. The town had not just rejected her, it had erased her. A fresh wave of despair washed over her, chilling her despite the scorching heat. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, a dry sob that never fully escaped. "Lily," she whispered again, her voice fainter now. "Why don't they care?" The question hung in the hot, still air, unanswered, unheard. She squeezed the doll tighter, her knuckles white. Her head drooped further, resting against the cool, worn wood of the trough. The rough texture pressed into her temple, a slight discomfort that was almost welcome, a distraction from the larger, all-consuming pain. A wave of dizziness swept over her, making the world spin faster, colors bleeding into one another. Her body felt heavy, impossibly heavy, as if made of lead. Each beat of her heart was a struggle, a weak flutter against the walls of her chest. The air, thick with dust and heat, felt too heavy to draw into her lungs. It burned with every shallow intake. She tried to move her fingers, to shift her position, but the effort was too great. Her limbs were unresponsive, weighted down by an unseen force. A strange metallic taste coated her tongue like old coins. It was the taste of her own failing body, a bitter farewell. A sudden shiver ran through her, an icy tremor that cut through the oppressive heat. It was a deep cold coming from within, spreading outwards from her core. Her teeth began to chatter, a tiny, almost imperceptible clicking sound in the vast silence of her personal collapse. This was it, she realized, with a chilling clarity. This was what it felt like. The fighting was over. There was no more strength left to draw upon, no hidden reserve of courage. The well was dry. She was empty. Her mind, once a whirlwind of desperate thoughts and pleading prayers, began to quiet. The sharp edges of hunger, the burning sting of rejection, they all began to blur, softening into a dull, distant ache. It was a strange kind of peace, born of utter exhaustion. She no longer felt the need to fight, to beg, to hope. There was only the slow, quiet surrender. Her grip on Lily, her loyal companion, loosened ever so slightly. The light around her seemed to dim, not because the sun was setting, but because her vision was failing. The edges of her sight were encroaching, a soft, fuzzy gray spreading inwards, like a curtain slowly being drawn. The vibrant yellows of the dust, the bleached whites of the buildings, the stark blues of the sky, all began to fade, losing their intensity. Her hearing, too, became muffled, the distant sounds of the town receding into an indistinct hum, like bees trapped in a jar. She could feel her eyelids growing heavier, pulling downwards, resisting her weak attempts to keep them open. The last vestiges of her awareness clung to the image of Lily, her small, unmoving face. She closed her eyes. The darkness was immediate, profound, and strangely comforting. It was a void free of pain, free of hunger, free of the judging eyes of Dust Devil Gulch. Her body slumped further against the trough, a small, lifeless form in the relentless afternoon sun. Her last conscious thought, a desperate, silent plea, was simply for an end to the pain. Silas Blackwood rode into Dust Devil Gulch with the sun a relentless hammer upon his hat. The very air tasted of grit and exhaustion, clinging to the back of his throat like a bad memory. His horse, a sturdy bay with a patient eye, moved with the measured gait of long travel, its hooves kicking up plumes of fine, pale dust. Every jar of the saddle sent a throb through his left arm, a dull, persistent ache beneath the tightly wound bandages. He had wrapped the wound himself days ago, somewhere in the jagged hills that guarded this valley, and the makeshift dressing offered little comfort. His face, etched by sun and a lifetime of hard choices, held a grim set, a testament to struggles seen and battles survived. He was merely passing through, seeking only a quiet corner, a warm meal, and perhaps a moment of respite before moving on. The town itself offered little promise of either. Dust Devil Gulch was a collection of sun-bleached wood and corrugated tin, huddled together against the vast, indifferent landscape. The general store, with its faded paint and leaning porch, looked as if it might collapse at any stray gust of wind. The saloon, a blocky structure further down the street, radiated a faint, sour smell even from a distance, a mixture of stale beer and desperation. A blacksmith's hammer rang out in rhythmic clangs, a lonely sound that echoed in the heavy air. Silas's gaze swept across the scene, taking in the sparse activity, the few figures moving slowly through the heat. He saw no welcome, no particular reason to linger, just another stop on a long, winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. His own weariness was a leaden cloak, heavy on his shoulders, making every breath a small effort. He pulled the reins gently, guiding his horse towards the weathered rail outside the saloon. The animal exhaled a long, dusty breath, grateful for the pause. Silas swung his leg over the saddle, a grunt escaping his lips as his injured arm protested the movement. He landed lightly on the parched earth, the familiar crunch of dry soil beneath his boots, a sound he had known for decades. He tied the reins with a practiced hand, his fingers stiff, and then stood for a moment, letting the blood flow back into his legs, feeling the sun bake into his clothes. He was tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled in the marrow. He glanced down the street again, his dark, observant eyes missing little, even in his weary state. The heat shimmered off the ground, distorting the few distant figures into wavering specters. His gaze drifted, almost idly, towards an old watering trough near the edge of the street. It was a crude wooden thing, filled with murky, stagnant water, an afterthought in this arid place. What caught his eye was not the trough itself, but the small, huddled form slumped against its base. It was almost invisible, blending in with the muted colors of the dirt and sun-bleached wood. At first, Silas thought it might be a pile of discarded rags, or perhaps some small, sleeping animal. But then, a faint glint of blonde hair, streaked with what looked like a grime, became visible. A child. A girl. She was small, too small, her limbs impossibly thin beneath the tattered fabric that covered her. A flicker of something he had not felt in a long time stirred within Silas. It was not pity, not yet, but a raw, unsettling recognition. He had seen too much of the world's indifference, too much suffering, to be easily moved. Yet the absolute stillness of the figure, the way she seemed to be absorbed by the earth itself, struck him. She was not merely sleeping. She was utterly inert, a small, broken statue carved from the dust. He took a slow step forward, then another, his boots raising soft puffs of dirt. The pain in his arms seemed to recede, replaced by a subtle shift in his focus. He could feel the sun still beating down, hotter now it seemed on this small, vulnerable form. He noticed the way her hair, despite the dirt, caught the light in places, a pale halo against the dark wood. His mind, usually a fortress of calm, detached observation, began to probe. Why was she there alone in the full glare of the midday sun? Where were her people? The town was quiet but not empty. He had seen men and women moving in and out of the general store, heard the distant laughter from the saloon. How could she remain unnoticed, or worse, ignored? A knot tightened in his stomach, a sensation familiar from long-forgotten days, a memory of injustice that still rankled deep within him. He saw the worn wood of the trough, splintered and rough, and imagined how uncomfortable it must be for a child to rest against it. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her face obscured, but her small hand, clutched tight, held something. A doll, perhaps. Silas took another few steps, his pace slow and deliberate. He felt the weight of his own journey, the sting of his wound, but another weight was pressing down now, a silent question demanding an answer. The air around him was still, save for the faint, monotonous hum of insects. The smell of dry earth was strong, almost overwhelming. He could feel the fine dust coating his tongue, a constant reminder of the barren land. Yet all these sensations were now background noise, secondary to the small, unmoving form by the trough. He scanned the street again, a slow, methodical sweep. No one seemed to be paying her any mind. A woman emerged from the general store, her arms laden with parcels, and walked past, her gaze fixed straight ahead. A man in overalls tinkered with a wagon wheel across the street, never once looking her way. It was as if the girl simply did not exist for them. This blatant disregard pricked at something deep within Silas. He had seen men turn a blind eye to many things in his life, but this felt different, more profound, more chilling. The girl was not hidden. She was in plain sight, yet utterly invisible. He imagined the hours she might have spent there, slowly succumbing to the heat and hunger. His own stomach gave a low rumble, reminding him of his need for food, but the thought of it now felt distant, almost unimportant. The sun continued its relentless descent, casting long, sharp shadows that barely reached the girl. Her clothes, ragged and oversized, seemed to swallow her small frame. He could almost feel the weight of her hunger, the hollowness in her belly, the deep-seated weariness that must have led her to this vulnerable position. He thought of his own path, the loneliness, the quiet burden he carried. He was not a man given to sentiment, nor was he one to interfere in the affairs of others. That was a lesson learned hard, etched into his very being. Yet the image of this girl, so utterly alone, so completely abandoned, seemed to bypass his defenses. Her face remained turned away, hidden in shadow. But he could imagine the hunger, the fear, the silent pleas that must have gone unanswered. He had seen similar expressions on the faces of men he had ridden with, men who had faced down desperate odds, but never on a child. The vulnerability was stark, a raw wound exposed to the harsh elements in the colder indifference of humanity. Silas moved closer still, drawn by an invisible thread. He could now make out the details of her tattered dress, the way the fabric was stained and frayed at the edges. Her small, still hand cradled the worn wooden doll, its arm missing, its painted eyes faded. It was a detail that twisted something inside him. A doll, her only companion, as broken as she seemed. He imagined the soft whispers she must have offered it, the silent comfort it must have provided in a world that offered none. The air, though hot, held a stillness that was almost unnatural, as if the very town held its breath around her. There was no sound from her, no breath, no sighing, just a profound quiet that spoke volumes of her suffering. He stopped a few feet from her, observing her closely now. He noticed the streaks of dirt on her pale skin, the chapped lips, the way her hair clung to her forehead with sweat and grime. She was gaunt, impossibly so, the kind of thinness that spoke of prolonged neglect. It was more than hunger. It was starvation, slow and agonizing. He had seen it in the eyes of animals left to fend for themselves, but never like this, never a human child, left to waste away on a town's main street. A flicker of something akin to anger ignited within him, a cold, steady flame that burned against the backdrop of his usual weariness. How could a place, a community, allow this to happen? What kind of people walk past such a sight, day after day, without so much as a glance? His own pain, the throbbing in his arm, the general fatigue that had dogged him for days, seemed to lessen in its intensity. It was replaced by a different kind of ache, a heavier one, rooted in the core of his being. He had always believed in standing on his own 2 feet, in facing his own battles. He had offered help when it was asked for, but he rarely sought to intervene unbidden. This felt different. This felt like an obligation, a silent call he could not ignore. The dust swirled around his boots, stirred by a faint, hot breeze, but the girl remained motionless. He wondered if she was even breathing. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through his weariness. He had seen death before, knew its stillness, its complete surrender. He hoped with a fervent hope that this was not it, not for a child so young. He reached for the water skin at his hip, his fingers brushing against the coarse leather. The water within was warm, but it was wet, and it was something. He hesitated, his hand hovering. Should he wake her? What if she startled, if she was afraid? What if she was beyond help? The questions tumbled through his mind, unbidden, disrupting the usual quiet order of his thoughts. He was a man of action, not introspection, yet here he stood contemplating the plight of a stranger, a child, in a town he barely knew. The sun continued to beat down, merciless and relentless, baking the already dry ground. The air felt heavy, stifling, as if it held its breath. Silas Blackwood, a man who had long ago learned to keep his distance, to build walls around his heart, felt those walls begin to crumble, just slightly. The familiar ache of his wound, a constant companion, now seemed trivial in comparison to the immense silent suffering before him. He had known loneliness, deep and abiding, but hers felt different, sharper, more desperate. It was the loneliness of a small boat adrift on an endless sea, with no land in sight. He looked at the crude doll in her hand again, a silent testimony to her isolated world. It was a stark reminder of innocence lost, of childhood stolen, of a future that seemed to be fading with every moment she lay there. He inhaled slowly, the dry air scratching at his throat. His gaze swept the street one last time. Still no one. The townspeople were busy with their own concerns, their own small lives, their own indifference. He had always believed that people were capable of great good and great evil, but it was the quiet, pervasive indifference that often did the most harm. It was the silence, the turning away, the refusal to acknowledge suffering that chipped away at the soul of a place. And here in Dust Devil Gulch, that indifference lay heavy on the air, thick as the dust that coated everything. A faint whisper of wind rustled through the brittle leaves of a nearby scrub brush, the only sound that seemed to acknowledge the girl's existence. Silas tightened his grip on the water skin. He had intended to ride through, to find a bed and a meal, then vanish into the horizon. He had no intention of getting involved, no desire to carry another burden. His own life was complicated enough, his own wounds, both visible and invisible, still fresh. Yet the sight of her, this small, broken figure, pulled at him with an unfamiliar force. It was a strange, undeniable tug at something deep within him, a quiet urgency that pushed aside his weariness and his ingrained caution. A question, unspoken and profound, began to form in his mind, a question about responsibility, about humanity, about the silent plea in the stillness of a child. The dusty air of Dust Devil Gulch hung heavy and still, pressing down on everything with a tangible weight. The sun, a relentless eye in the vast blue sky, bleached the world of all color, leaving only shades of dry earth and faded wood. Silas Blackwood moved through this oppressive silence, his boots crunching softly on the coarse dirt of the main street. Each step sent a jolt of dull pain up his bandaged arm, a constant reminder of the trouble he had barely outrun, but his gaze remained fixed on the small, still form slumped by the trough. He saw the faded blonde hair, matted with grime, spread like a frail halo around a face too small, too gaunt for a child. He saw the tattered fabric of her dress clinging to bony limbs, and the way her body seemed to melt into the dust, as if she were trying to become invisible. A worn wooden doll, its one arm missing, lay half buried in the dirt beside her, a silent sentinel to her misery. The sight gnawed at something deep within Silas, a memory perhaps, or simply the raw, aching truth of such profound neglect. He had witnessed cruelty in many forms, seen men stripped of their dignity by hunger and desperation, but this silent, helpless child stirred a different, sharper pain. The street was empty, a ghost town under the unforgiving noon, yet Silas felt the unseen eyes of the townspeople, peering from behind lace curtains and through cracks in saloon doors. They had seen her, surely. They had walked past her, perhaps even skirted wide around her as she lay there. He felt the prickle of their judgment, not just for the child, but already for him, a stranger daring to break the unspoken code of indifference. But the code meant nothing to him, not when faced with such profound need. His own needs, the gnawing ache of his arm, the fatigue that dragged at his bones, all faded before the stark reality of Alara's broken stillness. He reached the trough, the wooden boards rough and splintered beneath his fingertips as he braced himself. A grunt escaped his lips as he lowered himself, slowly, carefully, onto one knee beside her. The movement was difficult, his muscles protesting the strain, his wound thrumming with renewed pain. The smell of stale horse water and dry earth filled his nostrils, mixing with something sharper, the faint metallic scent of unwashed skin and desperation. He hovered for a moment, his broad hands suspended above her, hesitant. He did not want to startle her, did not want his touch to be another source of fear in a world that had clearly given her little else. He studied her face, thin and pale, marked by dirt and the ghost of tears. Her lips were cracked, a network of tiny fissures, and her breath came in shallow, almost imperceptible puffs. He wondered how long she had been there, how many sunrises and sunsets had painted the sky while her small body withered. A wave of anger, cold and sharp, washed over him, not at her, but at the world that had allowed this to happen. He pushed the feeling down, knowing anger would do nothing. Only action could. His fingers, calloused from years of working the land, moved with surprising tenderness. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched her forehead. Her skin was cool, almost clammy, not feverish as he had half expected, but unnaturally cold for the searing heat of the day. It was the chill of exhaustion, of a body running on empty, of a life force guttering low. He felt the fine, almost papery texture of her skin beneath his fingertips, the sharp outline of her brow bone. It was a fragile, heartbreaking thing to touch, a stark contrast to the rough hide of a horse or the sturdy wood of a fence post. He felt the subtle vibration of life beneath his touch, a faint pulse, a shallow breath, and a deep, quiet relief settled in his chest. She was alive, barely, but alive. The thought filled him with a fierce, unexpected resolve. He would not let her fade here, not under his watch. His thumb brushed a strand of matted hair from her face, a small, almost unconscious gesture of care. He imagined the softness her hair must once have held before the dust and the neglect had claimed it. Elara stirred. It was a tiny movement at first, a barely perceptible shift of her head against the rough wood of the trough. A low, guttural moan, thin as a whisper, escaped her chapped lips. Her body, a bundle of aching bones and strained muscles, resisted the pull back to consciousness, clinging to the dark, peaceful void it had found. A dull throbbing behind her eyes intensified, a drumbeat of pain that had been mercifully muted in her sleep. The world rushed back in fragments, harsh and unwelcome. The searing heat pressed down on her eyelids, even closed. The smell of dust, sharp and ever-present, reached at the back of her throat. There was a faint pressure on her forehead, a warmth that was unfamiliar, unsettling. It was not the biting chill of the night, nor the burning glare of the sun directly on her skin. It was something else, something yet firm, a memory, fleeting and blurry, of a rough shove, of a voice filled with disgust tried to surface, but her mind was too weary, too fogged with starvation to grasp it fully. A tremor ran through her small frame, a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. It was the instinct of a hunted animal, sensing a presence, a change in the air. Her chest felt tight, her lungs struggling for purchase, as if filled with sand. She wanted to retreat, to sink deeper into the nothingness, to escape the awakening pain, but the pressure on her forehead remained, a persistent anchor in the sea of her disorientation. Slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered. They felt heavy, gritty, as if they had been glued shut. The first thing she registered was a blinding blaze of light, forcing them to squeeze shut again. A whimper escaped her. She tried again, slower this time, allowing her eyes to adjust to the overwhelming brightness. The world swam into view, a distorted canvas of blurred yellows and browns. Her vision flickered, struggling to focus, each muscle in her eyes aching with the effort. Then, through the haze, she saw him, a face, shadowed by the brim of a hat, but undeniably there. It was not the scowling face of Martha Higgins, nor the sneering grin of the prospector, nor the averted gaze of the stable hand. This face was different. It was craggy, lined with hardship, but his eyes were kind. Deep, dark eyes, like pools reflecting the vast desert sky at dusk, held a steady, unwavering gaze that seemed to pierce through her confusion. His hand was still on her forehead, radiating a strange warmth that seeped into her temples. The touch was alien, a sensation she had not felt in what seemed like a lifetime, a touch devoid of anger, of dismissal, of pity. It was simply there, a quiet affirmation. Her own fear, a constant companion that had coiled itself around her heart, began to loosen its grip, just a fraction. It was still there, a bewildered, ancient fear, etched into the hollows of her cheeks. But now it was tinged with something new, something fragile and utterly bewildering. Her emaciated face, a map of her suffering, held the stark contrast of stark vulnerability and the faintest, most fleeting spark of something she dared not name. A strange warmth bloomed in Alara's chest, a tiny spark against the vast, cold emptiness that usually lived there. She saw the man's eyes, dark and deep, holding a quiet compassion she had never seen directed at her before. His gaze felt like a balm on her raw, exposed spirit, a gentle pressure that urged her to simply exist for a moment. Her own eyes, weighed in blue, reflected a bewilderment that mingled with a thread of deep, old fear. She was used to harsh glares or averted faces, not this steady, unwavering attention. A low, resonant sound then vibrated through the air, cutting through the buzzing in her ears. It was the stranger's voice, a gravelly timbre that somehow felt like the promise of solid ground. "You look like you could use a warm meal, little one." The words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of revelation. A warm meal. The very idea felt impossible, a cruel trick of her fading consciousness. Her stomach, a tight knot of pain, protested even the thought. Could a person truly eat again after so long? The hunger was not just a feeling, it was a part of her, a constant, gnawing companion. Silas Blackwood's hand, warm and firm, then settled on her arm. It was not a rough grab nor a dismissive shove, but a careful, respectful touch. He helped her slowly, gently, to her feet. Her limbs felt like brittle twigs, each joint a protest against movement. The world swayed around her, a kaleidoscope of dust and faded wood. She gripped her wooden doll tighter, her knuckles white, as if the small, carved figure was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. The sun, still merciless, beat down on her head, but the stranger's shadow fell over her, a momentary reprieve. As she stood, swaying slightly, the reality of her position hit her with fresh force. She was in the middle of Dust Devil Gulch, surrounded by the very people who had watched her fade. The general store, the livery stable, the saloon, all the places that had turned their backs were now witness to this strange intervention. A low murmur rippled through the street. Faces, previously indifferent or scornful, now wore expressions of confusion, curiosity, and outright disapproval. Alara felt their eyes on her, sharp and probing, as if she were a spectacle, a mistake being corrected in a way they did not understand. She saw Martha Higgins standing in the doorway of her general store, her mouth a tight, thin line. Martha's eyes, usually narrowed in judgment, were now wide with something akin to shock. Alara's blood ran cold. Martha's presence was a physical manifestation of the town's rejection, a constant reminder of every slammed door, every cold word. The thought of walking anywhere with this man, under the weight of those stairs, made her want to sink back into the dust. Her legs, already weak, trembled with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with fear. But Silas did not waver. His grip remained steady, a silent assurance. He began to guide her not towards the general store where the scent of fresh bread had once teased her, nor towards the relative anonymity of the town's edge. Instead, he led her directly towards the saloon, the very place from which she had been so roughly expelled just hours ago. The swinging doors, symbols of her humiliation, now seemed to loom before her like a dark, forbidding gate. Her breath hitched. Inside that building were men who had laughed at her, who had called her names, who had sent her sprawling. Panic tightened its icy grip around her chest. Her throat felt dry, even drier than usual. She wanted to pull away, to hide, to disappear back into the anonymity of the alleyways. But Silas's hand was firm, his stride deliberate. He moved with an authority that brooked no argument, a quiet strength that felt both terrifying and strangely protective. He pushed one of the saloon doors open with his free hand, the creak of the wood echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of the street. The air inside hit Alara like a physical wall. It was thick with the cloying smell of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and sweat, a stark contrast to the dry, dusty air outside. The saloon, usually a cacophony of shouts and clinking glasses, fell silent the moment they stepped inside. Every head turned. The card players at their tables, the men leaning against the bar, the bartender wiping glasses, all froze, their eyes fixed on the sight of Silas Blackwood, a respected if mysterious figure, walking in with a dirty, emaciated child. Alara felt herself shrink, trying to make herself invisible behind the stranger's long frame. She could feel the heat of their stares, hear the nervous coughs, the shuffling of feet. Their silence was more terrifying than their previous jeers. Silas, however, seemed oblivious to the sudden shift in atmosphere. He led Alara to a small, empty table in a corner, away from the direct light of the windows. He helped her into a rickety wooden chair, which felt surprisingly solid beneath her. She sat stiffly, her small hands still clutching her worn wooden doll, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The prospector who had shoved her earlier was at the bar, his face a mask of surprise and discomfort. He quickly turned his back, pretending to be deeply engrossed in his drink. The bartender, a burly man named Frank, wiped the counter with unusual vigor, his eyes avoiding Silas's. Silas leaned over the table, his voice still low, but with an edge of quiet command that made the silence in the saloon even deeper. "Frank, we need a bowl of your best stew hot, and a generous portion of that fresh bread you just baked." His words were not a request, they were an expectation. Frank, usually gruff and dismissive, stammered a reluctant, "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, right away." He hurried off towards the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans suddenly amplified in the unnerving quiet. Alara watched Silas, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This man, a stranger, was ordering food for her. Not a discarded crust, not a stale crumb, but a bowl of hot stew and fresh bread. It was a concept so alien to her recent experience that it felt like a dream, a cruel mirage. Her stomach gave a painful lurch, a mix of desperate anticipation and deep, deep fear. What if it was taken away? What if she woke up? Her fingers tightened around the doll's smooth, worn head, her only comfort in this bewildering moment. The wait felt endless, each second stretching into an eternity. The saloon remained hushed, the men occasionally exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared speak above a whisper. They watched Silas, then Alara, their usual boisterousness completely extinguished by the stranger's presence. Alara felt their silent judgment, their unspoken questions. Why her? Why this child? She knew what they were thinking. She was a burden, a blight, an inconvenience. But Silas sat across from her, his gaze steady, his presence a shield against their silent condemnation. He did not speak, simply watched her, as if giving her space to breathe, to exist in this strange, new reality. Finally, Frank returned, placing a steaming bowl of stew and a thick slice of crusty bread on the table between them. The aroma hit Alara first, rich and warm and utterly intoxicating. It smelled of beef, carrots, potatoes, and something else she couldn't quite name, a scent of nourishment, of life. Her mouth watered with an intensity that made her jaw ache. Her eyes, wide as saucers, fixed on the bowl. The stew was thick, bubbling gently, a deep, inviting brown. Small chunks of meat and vegetables floated within it, gleaming in the dim light. The bread, still warm from the oven, sat beside it, its golden crust inviting. It was more food than she had seen in weeks, certainly more than she had imagined possessing. Her entire existence had become a relentless, solitary quest for the smallest scrap. Now, this abundance. It felt dangerous, too good to be true. She couldn't tear her gaze away from it, her breath catching in her throat. A part of her expected it to vanish, to dissolve into thin air like all her other desperate hopes. Her hands trembled, not with weakness now, but with an overwhelming mix of disbelief and agonizing anticipation. She looked at Silas, a silent question in her eyes. Was this truly for her? Silas gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Go on, little one," he said softly, his voice cutting through the fog of her fear and hunger. "It's all yours." He pushed the bowl slightly closer to her, the warm ceramic radiating a comforting heat. Alara reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers brushing against the rough, warm surface of the bowl. It felt real, the heat was real, the smell was real. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her eyes burned. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the spoon. It felt heavy and alien in her trembling hand. It had been so long since she had held such an implement, so long since she had eaten with anything but her bare fingers, picking at whatever meager scraps she could find. The cold metal against her palm was a shock, a sudden reminder of a world she had almost forgotten. She dipped the spoon into the rich, fragrant stew. The liquid parted easily, scooping up a tiny piece of potato and a speck of carrot. She lifted the spoon, her hands shaking so violently that a small amount of the precious liquid splashed onto the table. She didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on that single spoonful, bringing it slowly toward her lips. The journey felt monumental, a pilgrimage. Her hunger screamed, a raw, primal demand, but a deep-seated caution held her back. What if it was a trick? What if it wasn't safe? The years of neglect and betrayal had taught her to trust nothing, especially not unsolicited kindness. Yet, Silas watched her, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaotic storm of her emotions. His eyes held no judgment, only a patient understanding. Taking a ragged breath, she finally brought the spoon to her mouth. The first taste, it was an explosion of warmth, of savory goodness, of pure, unadulterated nourishment. It was salty and rich, filling her mouth with a flavor so profound, so utterly satisfying, that it almost overwhelmed her. It was everything her body had craved, everything her starving cells had cried out for. A single tear, hot and heavy, detached itself from the corner of her eye. It traced a clean path through the grime and dust on her cheek, a small river cutting through the landscape of her suffering. It was not a tear of sadness, not exactly, but a tear of release, of profound relief, of a dawning, terrifying hope. The taste of the warm stew, so simple, so fundamental, was almost too much for her senses to bear. The rich, earthy scent of beef and vegetables swirled around Alara, filling her nostrils with an unfamiliar kindness. Each spoonful of stew was a small miracle, a warm tide flowing into the hollow ache that had consumed her for so long. She ate slowly, deliberately, not wanting the moment to end, her eyes fixed on the ceramic bowl as if it might vanish. Her small, chapped lips trembled slightly with each bite, a silent testament to the overwhelming relief that coursed through her weary body. The clatter of glasses and low murmur of voices from the saloon faded into a distant hum, her world narrowing to the simple, profound act of eating. Silas Blackwood sat opposite her, his own plate of food completely untouched. His gaze, steady and calm, never left Alara. He watched the way her small hand clutched the spoon, the careful movements as she lifted it to her mouth, and the flicker of surprise in her eyes with every swallow. A quiet satisfaction settled deep within him, easing some of the weariness etched into his own face. He had seen too much hunger in his life, too many empty gazes, and this small girl was a stark reminder of the world's harsh indifference. For a moment, the pain in his bandaged arms seemed less sharp, overshadowed by the sight of her slow, deliberate nourishment. He could still taste the dust of the road, feel the ache in his bones, but watching her eat felt like a balm to his own troubled spirit. Alara felt his eyes upon her, a new sensation after years of being either ignored or met with scorn. It was not a judgmental stare, nor one filled with disgust. It was simply watching. It made her uncomfortable at first, a raw nerve exposed, but there was no malice in his gaze. It felt like the kind of watchfulness a rancher might give a newborn calf, a quiet protective presence. The stew was almost gone, and a new fear began to creep in, the familiar dread of the empty plate, the return to her gnawing hunger. Her stomach, stretched and warm, sent signals of contentment she had not felt in years, a sensation almost overwhelming in its unfamiliarity. Silas reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch. He untied the drawstring with his uninjured hand, revealing several strips of dark, dried meat. He selected one, a long, thin piece of jerky, and held it out to her. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of unspoken understanding. He offered it not as charity, but as a shared provision, a silent acknowledgement of her needs beyond the immediate meal. The smell of the jerky, smoky and rich, reached her, a promise of further sustenance. Alara hesitated, her eyes flicking from the jerky to Silas's face, then back again. This was another offering, another kindness she was unprepared for. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, reached out and carefully took the piece of meat. It was firm and rough to the touch, a texture far removed from the soft stew. She nibbled at it, the salty, savory flavor a welcome contrast, solidifying the feeling of fullness in her belly. This man was not like the others. He did not look away. He did not dismiss her. He simply offered what he had, without a word, without a demand. The saloon's atmosphere, usually so loud and boisterous, seemed to hold its breath around them. Martha Higgins stood behind the bar, her face a mask of disapproval, her eyes narrowed. Other patrons occasionally glanced their way, their conversations hushed, a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled resentment. But Silas seemed oblivious to their stares, his focus entirely on the girl. He had created a small, quiet bubble around their table, a temporary sanctuary from the harsh realities of Dust Devil Gulch. Alara felt it too, that strange bubble of safety, a feeling as foreign and disorienting as the taste of proper food. When Alara had finished the last shred of jerky, her hands feeling strangely heavy and satisfied, Silas leaned forward slightly. His dark eyes met hers, holding a depth she could not fathom, a quiet strength that offered an unexpected anchor. His voice, low and gravelly, cut through the residual background noise of the saloon, clear and unwavering. No one deserves to starve, especially not a child. The words hung in the air, suspended like dust motes in a sunbeam, slowly settling into the very core of Alara's being. It was not a question, not a judgment, but a simple, profound statement of truth. A truth she had never been told, never been allowed to believe. For so long she had accepted the town's unspoken verdict, that her hunger was her own fault, her plight a burden, that she deserved the emptiness, the cold, the fear. Her father's abandonment had echoed in every turned back, every cruel word, every slamming door. But Silas's words shattered that cruel illusion. They were a balm to wounds she had carried deep inside, wounds she thought would never heal. No one deserves to starve, especially not a child. The phrase repeated in her mind, a quiet revolution. It was a recognition of her humanity, a validation of her worth, a simple declaration that her suffering was wrong, not earned. A strange, unfamiliar warmth began to spread through her chest, deeper than the heat of the stew, more profound than the satisfaction of the jerky. It was the warmth of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being told she mattered. Her small hands, no longer clutching the wooden doll, rested on the scarred tabletop. The grimy wood felt solid beneath her fingertips, grounding her in this new, bewildering reality. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes again. But these were different. They were not tears of pain or despair, but of a strange, fragile release. She had been holding her breath for so long, and now, perhaps, she could finally let it go. The constant knot of fear in her stomach had begun to loosen, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She looked up at Silas, her wide blue eyes searching his. The grime on her cheek still marked the path of her earlier tears, but her gaze was steadier now, less haunted. She had eaten, she was warm, and someone had spoken words of kindness directly to her. 1,000 unspoken questions swirled in her mind, a torrent of desperate hope and cautious optimism. Who was this man? Why was he different? Could this feeling, this fragile moment of peace, possibly last? Could it be real? A question began to form in the deepest part of her heart, a tiny budding seed in a landscape long barren, but she dared not yet voice it. The warmth spread not just from the food, but from something far deeper, something she could not yet name, but desperately wanted to hold on to. The last trace of the warm stew still lingered on Alara's tongue, a flavor she might never forget, a richness that defied all the years of gnawing emptiness. She looked at Silas, his steady gaze holding something she could not quite name, something different from pity or scorn. It felt like recognition, like he saw a human being, not just a problem. The question forming in her heart was a fragile, tender thing, barely a whisper inside her, a hope so terrifyingly delicate she dared not even think its shape. Silas leaned forward slightly, his eyes still fixed on hers, and his voice dropped to a quiet rumble, almost like the low hum of a distant melody. "I have a place, little one," he began, his words slow and thoughtful, each one seeming to find its exact spot in the saloon's clamor. The noise around them, the clinking glasses, the rough laughter, all seemed to fade for Alara, replaced by the steady rhythm of his voice. "It is called Whispering Pines." A shiver traced its way down Alara's spine, not of cold, but of something else entirely. Whispering Pines, the name itself was soft, a stark contrast to the sharp, biting dust of Dust Devil Gulch. She imagined tall, dark trees, their branches swaying in an unseen breeze, making a sound like secrets shared. Could such a place truly exist? Her world had always been hard edges and harsh sun, the ground beneath her feet as unforgiving as the faces of the townspeople. "It is a good place," Silas continued. a faint smile touching the corners of his lips. He was looking past her now, as if seeing the ranch in his mind's eye, the details vivid and real. The land there is honest. It gives back what you put into it, fair and true. Honest land. Alara had never considered land could be honest. The land here in Dust Devil Gulch had offered nothing but dust and thorns, a relentless, dry hunger that mirrored her own. What did it mean for land to be honest? Did it mean it would not trick you, would not suddenly turn barren, would not hide its bounty? She pictured rich, dark soil, instead of the pale, brittle dirt she knew, soil that promised growth and life, not just decay. A strange warmth spread through her chest at the thought, a feeling both comforting and deeply unfamiliar. And the people, Silas added, bringing his gaze back to her, they are honest too. This struck Alara with a force that made her flinch inwardly. People. She knew people. Martha Higgins with her tight lips and sharp words, the prospector who had shoved her, the stable hand who had looked away. Their face, hard and unyielding, flashed before her eyes. Honesty in people was a concept as foreign as a full stomach. She had learned to expect suspicion, to anticipate rejection, to brace herself against the sting of indifference. The idea that people could be simply, genuinely honest, without hidden motives or sudden cruelties, seemed almost impossible. A beautiful lie. A deep sigh escaped her, one she had not realized she was holding. She had lived in a world where every interaction felt like a trap, every glance a judgment. To imagine a place where faces held no scorn, where voices carried no threat, was like imagining a different kind of air to breathe. She craved that air with a desperate, aching intensity she had never known she possessed. Silas took a slow sip of water, giving her a moment, letting his words settle. The clatter of a dropped bottle behind them made her jump, a sharp reminder of the harsh reality of the saloon, the coarse nature of her present surroundings. But then Silas spoke again, and the world narrowed once more to his voice. "We have horses," he said, his eyes softening further. "Strong ones with good hearts. They know the trails and the work." Horses. Alara had only ever seen them pulling wagons, their flanks dusty, their eyes distant, or standing in the livery, their tails swishing flies. They were magnificent, powerful creatures, but always part of the backdrop of her suffering, never something she could approach. She pictured horses with sleek, well-groomed coats, their breath misting in the cool morning air, their manes flowing freely. Could she ever touch a horse like that, feel the warmth of its hide beneath her small hand? The thought was a flicker of unexpected joy, a pure, simple image in her mind. "And chickens," Silas continued, a hint of amusement in his tone. "They are noisy things, always clucking, but they lay good eggs, fresh ones every morning." Chickens, eggs, real, fresh eggs. Alara's stomach gave a faint, hopeful flutter. Her experience with food had been defined by scraps, by the fear of going without. To think of food as something fresh, abundant, and freely given was a revolutionary concept. She imagined the soft warmth of a freshly laid egg in her palm, the rich yellow yolk, something she had only seen from afar, behind the glass of Martha Higgins's store. It was a luxury beyond her wildest imaginings, a simple pleasure that felt like a lifetime away. He went on to describe the quiet rhythm of farm life, his words painting a picture that slowly unfolded in Alara's mind, vibrant and compelling. He spoke of the sun rising over the distant hills, painting the sky with colors she had only ever seen in dusty sunsets over the arid plains. He described the smell of damp earth after a rare rain, the scent of pine needles underfoot, the clean, crisp air that filled your lungs and made them ache with its purity. Alara had always known the smell of stale whiskey, of horse manure, of the dry, baking dust that coated everything. The idea of air that smelled of pine, of fresh earth, was like a promise, a breath of life she hadn't realized she was suffocating without. Her chest felt tight, a strange mixture of hope and a profound, aching sadness for all the years she had lived without such simple beauty. She envisioned the gentle sounds of the ranch, the soft nickering of horses, the distant bleating of sheep, the steady rhythm of a farmer working the land. These were sounds of life, of purpose, of peace. Her world had been filled with the mournful creak of the saloon sign, the distant, hollow clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the mocking laughter of children who chased her away. The contrast was so stark, so absolute, it felt like two entirely different worlds existed side by side, and she had only ever known the cruel one. Her mind raced, taking every detail Silas offered and building upon it, creating a sanctuary in her imagination. She saw herself not as the gaunt, ragged girl she was, but as a small figure moving through green fields, her bare feet touching cool, soft grass. She saw herself collecting eggs, not stealing them. She saw herself talking to the horses, their large, gentle eyes looking back at her without judgment. She imagined sleeping in a real bed, not on cold, hard ground, the sounds of the ranch a lullaby instead of the terrifying silence of an empty alley. This was a life she had only ever dreamed of in fragmented, desperate moments, when the hunger was too much to bear and her imagination was the only refuge she had left. But even then, her dreams had been cautious, small. A single piece of bread, a warm corner to sleep. They had never dared to reach for a place, a whole world where honesty lived in the land and in the hearts of people. A wave of dizziness washed over Alara, not from hunger now, but from the sheer weight of possibility. Could such a future truly be real? Or was this just another cruel trick, another fleeting moment of kindness before the inevitable return to the harsh reality of Dust Devil Gulch? Her past had taught her to be wary of promises, to guard her heart against hope, because hope, she had learned, was the most painful thing to lose. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the worn wooden doll in her lap, her only constant companion, her silent confidant. Its smooth, chipped surface felt familiar, a small anchor in the storm of new feelings swirling within her. The doll had seen all her tears, all her hunger, all her silent pleas. It was a testament to her endurance, but also a symbol of her utter aloneness. Silas paused again, letting the images he had painted sink in, watching Alara's face, her wide, haunted blue eyes now holding a spark he had not seen before. He did not press her, did not rush her, just waited patiently, his presence a quiet, solid reassurance. Alara felt the warmth in her belly, the echo of the kind words Silas had spoken, the vivid pictures of whispering pines. And then, a profound, almost unbearable longing stirred within her. It was a yearning for that honest land, for those honest people, for the quiet rhythm of a life that held purpose and peace. It was a desperate hope, fierce and raw, for a place where she might finally belong, where she would not be an outcast, a burden, a ghost haunting the edges of a town that wished her gone. The thought of returning to the alley, to the relentless sun, to the scornful glances of Martha Higgins and the indifferent faces of the townspeople, became an unbearable weight. Dust Devil Gulch, which had been her entire world, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, its air suddenly thin and suffocating. The promise of whispering pines shone like a beacon, bright and distant, yet suddenly within reach. The pain of her past, the loneliness, the gnawing hunger, all of it intensified the yearning for this new, unimaginable future. Staying here in this place of rejection and starvation was no longer an option her heart could bear. The words hung in the air, a melody Alara had never heard, a tune of quiet possibility. Silas Blackwood's voice was soft, yet it resonated with a strength that seemed to fill the dusty saloon. "I could use a helping hand at the ranch," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "There's always work and a warm bed and food enough for two." Ilara's heart, which had just begun to settle from the warmth of the stew, now hammered against her ribs with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. Her eyes wide and luminous in her small, pale face, fixed on him, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the cruelty she had come to expect from the world. Was this a trick? A cruel joke some grown-up would play before laughing in her face? The thought was a cold splash of water, extinguishing the fragile warmth that had bloomed inside her. She had been offered scraps, insults, and indifference, but never, not once, had anyone offered her a home, a place to belong. The idea itself felt impossibly vast, a landscape she could not even begin to imagine. The worn wooden doll clutched in her lap felt suddenly heavier, a tangible link to the miserable existence she knew. She traced the smooth, familiar curve of its missing arm with her thumb, a small, unconscious gesture of comfort. Her mind spun, caught between the terrifying unknown of Silas's offer and the crushing, familiar reality of her current existence. The saloon, which had felt like a temporary refuge, now seemed to press in on her, its stale air thick with the smell of whiskey and fear. She remembered the gnawing ache in her stomach, the constant, relentless hunger that had been her most loyal companion for as long as she could remember. She remembered the cold, how it seeped into her bones at night, making her shiver even when wrapped tightly in her thin shawl. She remembered the faces of the townspeople, their eyes either sliding past her as if she were air or narrowing with undisguised contempt. Each memory was a sharp, distinct pain, a wound that had never truly healed. The memory of Martha Higgins's sharp voice, "We've nothing for beggars," echoed in her ears, as clear as if the woman stood beside her, and the prospector's rough shove, the way he had thrown her to the ground like a piece of trash, still made her wince. And the stable hand, kind-faced but turning away, pretending not to see her. That was perhaps the worst of all, the sting of being utterly invisible. These were the lessons Dust Devil Gulch had taught her, etched deep into her young soul. Her gaze drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the bat-winged doors of the saloon. Through the gaps and cracks, she could see glimpses of the dusty street outside, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. And then she saw them. Faces, peering in, drawn by the unusual sight of Silas Blackwood, the mysterious stranger, sharing a meal with the town's pariah. There was Old Man Henderson from the general store, his eyes squinting, a frown creasing his brow. Next to him, a couple of the younger men, drifters who sometimes passed through, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled scorn. And then there was Martha Higgins, her stern face framed by the saloon doorway, her eyes, usually sharp and critical, now glinting with a cold, almost predatory disapproval. Her mouth was pursed tightly, a familiar expression Alara knew meant condemnation. A shiver, not of cold but of a deep, familiar dread, ran down Alara's spine. They were watching, always watching. They had seen her at her lowest, had watched her starve, had turned their backs on her time and again. Now they watched this strange act of kindness, with suspicion and disdain. She knew what they were thinking. She could almost hear their whispers, the judgments forming on their lips. That worthless child. Who does she think she is? The crushing reality of Dust Devil Gulch suddenly felt heavier, more suffocating than ever before. It was a town that had consistently denied her even the basic right to exist. A town that saw her not as a human being, but as a stain, a burden. She had been left to fend for herself, to wither away, to disappear. And now this man, this kind stranger with the sad eyes, was offering her an escape, a pathway out of the suffering. Yet the unknown was a formidable adversary. What did ranch truly mean? What would she have to do? Would she be good enough? The thought of leaving everything, even the familiar misery of Dust Devil Gulch, was terrifying. It was the only world she had ever known, the only landscape her young eyes had ever seen. The fear of being rejected again, of failing in this new alien place, gnawed at her. What if Silas Blackwood, like all the others, eventually grew tired of her, discovered she was not worth the effort, and cast her out once more? The thought was a sharp pang, a fresh wound opening in her already tender heart. She remembered her father, his rough hands sometimes gentle, sometimes impatient, but always there, until one day it wasn't. He had left her with a few meager coins and a vague promise, a promise that had dissolved into the desert wind, just like he had. Her small hands tightened around the wooden doll, a silent anchor in the swirling storm of her thoughts. She had learned early that promises were often empty, and kindness was a fleeting shadow. Silas Blackwood remained silent, allowing her the space to wrestle with her decision. He understood the weight of his offer, the profound shift it represented for a child who had known nothing but hardship. He watched the emotions flicker across her face, the fear, the hunger for something better, the desperate calculation. Alara's gaze traveled from the peering faces in the doorway back to Silas, then to the half-eaten bowl of stew on the table. The steam still rose faintly, a comforting wisp in the cool air of the saloon. She remembered the taste, the warmth spreading through her empty stomach, chasing away the cold. That warmth, that feeling of being cared for, was still a fragile ember within her. She looked at her torn, oversized clothes, the dirt under her fingernails, the small cuts and bruises on her hands from scrabbling for food. She was a child, yet she felt aged by experience, her spirit weary from constant struggle. The thought of another night spent shivering in an alley, another day of scrounging for crumbs, was a bitter, nauseating prospect. It was a choice between a known hell and an unknown heaven. Her gaze landed again on Martha Higgins. The woman's lips were now moving. Though Alara couldn't hear the words, she could guess their venomous content. Martha's eyes narrowed to slits, pierced Alara, stripping away any last shred of dignity she might have had. It was a look that said, "You don't deserve this. You don't deserve anything good." In that moment, something shifted within Alara. The fear, though still present, began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning ember of defiance. Martha Higgins's glare, so full of judgment and disdain, no longer felt like a condemnation. Instead, it became a catalyst, a sharp, undeniable reminder of everything she was leaving behind. This was not just an offer of food or a bed, it was an escape from those eyes, those whispers, that crushing indifference. The thought of staying, of continuing to endure Martha Higgins's scorn and the town's cruel neglect, suddenly felt more terrifying than any unknown. The memory of the hunger, the cold, the loneliness rose up, a tangible, suffocating weight. She had nothing to lose, not truly. Her life here was a slow, painful fading. A decision, firm and resolute, began to crystallize within her. The image of Martha Higgins's disapproving glare solidified Alara's resolve, pushing her towards the promise of the unknown. The air tasted of fine dust, a flavor Alara knew intimately. Her bony fingers locked around the worn wooden doll, its chipped surface a familiar comfort. The doll, her only witness, absorbed the tremor running through her. Silas cinched the saddle with quiet competence, his fluid movements a stark contrast to Alara's frantic heart. The leather creaked softly, a sound of strength, unlike the town's harsh clamor. She inhaled the horse's scent, a mix of warm hay and sweat. It promised open spaces, a world beyond Dust Devil Gulch she had only dreamed of. Her wide eyes traced Silas's back. His worn rancher's coat, faded from sun and wind, held quiet strength. She remembered its warmth when he helped her, a tenderness she had never known. The dusty street, usually a stage for humiliation, now felt different. It was a path to an unknown future. Alara felt the silent judgment of unseen eyes, burning holes in her tattered dress. Their scorn, a bitter tang, was a familiar sensation. But today it felt like a parting gift, confirming everything she left behind. A small, fierce pride unfurled within her. She was leaving in defiance. Her gaze drifted to the horse, a magnificent creature with a sleek, dark coat. Its muscles rippled, pawing the ground once. She wondered what it felt like to ride something so powerful. Her experience with animals was limited to snarling stray dogs or indifferent livery horses. This horse felt different, a silent ally. Mounting it was both thrilling and terrifying. She imagined the wind in her hair, moving freely from Dust Devil Gulch's stagnant air. Silas finished preparations, giving the saddle a reassuring pat. He turned to Alara, his kind, dark eyes meeting hers. There was no pity, only quiet understanding. "Ready, Alara?" he asked, his low voice cutting through the town's murmur. His voice was a lifeline. She swallowed, throat dry, finding strength. She met his wounds, a small nod her only answer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. She was ready. A sharp gust of wind swirled, kicking up dust devils. It carried stale beer from the saloon and fresh bread from Martha Higgins's general store. Alara's eyes narrowed, focused. This was her farewell, her final reckoning with the place that had been her tormentor. She swept her gaze over the weathered buildings of Dust Devil Gulch. Each one held a memory, a specific sting of loneliness. Her eyes settled first on the general store. The faded red paint, peeling in the merciless sun, mocked her. She remembered countless times pressing her nose against its grimy window, stomach aching, watching Martha Higgins arrange goods and golden loaves. The scent had been torment, a cruel reminder of hunger. Martha had slammed the back door in her face, the words, "We've nothing for beggars," still stinging. That moment had solidified her outcast status. A tiny, hot ember of resentment still glowed, but now with detachment. The pain was there, a ghost limb of past suffering, yet it no longer paralyzed her. It fueled a quiet resolve. She would never again beg for scraps. She would never again feel that searing shame. This time she walked away by choice. Then her gaze shifted to the saloon. The swinging doors, a muted brown, swayed faintly, alive with ghosts of drunken laughter. She remembered the burly prospector, his face distorted, his sneer as he shoved her to the ground. Sharp pain, grit and blood, humiliation hotter than any fever. She had felt small then, crushed by indifference. His laughter, joined by others, echoed her worthlessness. But now, looking at the saloon, defiance swelled. She had endured it all. She had survived. The town had tried to break her spirit, to starve her, but it failed. She was still here, breathing, capable of hope. The memories remained, but no longer held her captive. They were markers on a journey taking a new direction. The sun, which had always mocked her, now felt like a spotlight on her departure. This was not retreat, it was a triumphant exit. She scanned other buildings, the dusty livery, the homes where families ate warm meals. The entire street, once a landscape of despair, shrank under her gaze. It was a place she was shedding, like an old, tattered skin. A profound sense of liberation, tinged with sadness, settled over her. The air, usually thick with misery, felt lighter, almost breathable. This was goodbye, a silent severance. She turned her back on hunger, on aching loneliness. Silas, sensing her farewell, remained silent, offering only his steady presence. When Alara turned back, her eyes held a newfound spark, a quiet determination. He offered his strong, calloused hand. "Up you go," he murmured, his voice soft. Alara took a deep breath, the air filling with hope. It felt like letting go of the past, pulling in the future. She placed her trembling foot into the stirrup Silas held steady. The leather was warm beneath her worn boot. With a surge of strength, she pushed upward. Her weakened muscles protested, but adrenaline propelled her. Silas gave a gentle boost, guiding her. She swung her other leg over the horse's broad back, awkward yet exhilarating. She settled behind him, the saddle a soft cradle. The height was astonishing. From the ground, the world seemed vast. Now perched, she felt elevated, seeing over her past. The street, buildings, even the distant mountains stretched out differently. The horse itself was a revelation. Its warmth seeped into her bones, chasing fear's chill. Its powerful flank shifted, a solid, reassuring presence. She felt its immense power. She was part of it, carried by its strength. Her small hand instinctively reached for anchor. Fingers brushed Silas's rough coat. She gripped it, not frantically, but with a quiet, certain hold. It was a tangible link to her new beginning. His worn coat felt strong, protective. She felt his steady breathing, his back against her front. For the first time, she wasn't truly alone. She had a protector, a guide. The wooden doll, still clutched, felt less like her only companion, more like a cherished keepsake. It was a reminder, but no longer a burden. A faint breeze ruffled her blonde hair, a freedom she yearned for. She closed her eyes briefly, letting feelings wash over her. The horse's warmth, Silas's scent, the quiet hum. It was a profound transition, a bridge between a desolate past and a hopeful future. She opened her eyes, ready, her grip firm, her spirit lighter. The world felt bigger, full of breath, a contrast to her suffocating former life. She was rising. Silas tugged the reins. With a soft cluck, the horse moved. Each hoofbeat against the packed earth marked the journey's start. Powerful legs moved with effortless grace, carrying them away. Alara held her breath. She watched as Martha Higgins's store slid from view, its faded sign shrinking. The saloon, with its silent doors, became a smaller shadow. Dust Devil Gulch, once inescapable, huddled into the distance. She peered over Silas's shoulder, taking one last look at her birthplace and tormentor. It blurred, losing its oppressive edges. The townspeople's faces, once judgmental blurs, faded with distance. A giddy sensation rose, a heavy weight lifting. The air, once thick with condemnation, now tasted clean, carrying wild sagebrush and distant pine. The horse's pace was steady, a relentless march from her past. The dusty street, once despair's boundary, became a narrow ribbon. Every hoofbeat was a step into the unknown, a further severance. A shiver ran through Alara, a complex mix of emotions. Trepidation whispered doubts. What if Whispering Pines Ranch was not what Silas promised? What if she failed, alone again in a harsh world? The unknown stretched like a dark ocean. But woven with that fear, overriding it, was an intoxicating freedom. A wild, untamed feeling, like the wind whipping past her ears. Freedom to breathe without judgment, from gnawing hunger, from being painfully invisible. She felt a lightness, a burgeoning possibility that made her heart sing with defiant joy. The future was unwritten, a blank slate waiting for her to etch a life of her own. The sun, beginning its descent, cast golden shadows, painting distant hills. The silence, broken only by hooves and Saddle Creek, felt vast and welcoming. Dust Devil Gulch, a desolate silhouette, shrank to a faint smudge on the horizon, a memory fading. Elara tightened her grip on Silas's coat, not from fear, but fierce, exhilarating hope. Her old life shrank. A new one, brimming with terrifying possibilities, rushed to meet her. Alara's body still felt the tremor of leaving Dust Devil Gulch, a faint echo of the terror that had clung to her for so long. The horse's steady rhythm beneath her, however, began to lull away the lingering fear, replacing it with a strange, nascent calm. She kept her small hand gripped on Silas's coat, the rough fabric a surprising comfort against her palm. The dust of the town faded behind them, replaced by the scent of dry earth and something new, something greener. The landscape shifted with each mile. The barren, sun-baked plains gradually gave way to rolling hills, their slopes dotted with scrub brush and hardy, wind-bent trees. Alara watched it all, her blue eyes wide, absorbing every detail as if seeing the world for the first time. She had known only the dusty, narrow confines of the town, the oppressive weight of its indifference. This vast, open space felt like a breath she had not known she needed to take. The wind, which had once felt like a stinging whip in Dust Devil Gulch, here carried a cooler, gentler touch, rustling through the sparse grasses. Silas rode silently beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but Alara felt his presence, a quiet anchor in this new, overwhelming world. She risked a glance at his profile, noticing the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair was swept back by the breeze. He had offered her food, kindness, and now this, a ride into the unknown. A part of her, the old, cautious part, still waited for the catch, for the moment when the kindness would dry up, just as it always had before. But another part, a smaller, fragile flicker, dared to hope this time might be different. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the air grew noticeably cooler. A new scent began to filter through the dry air, a fresh, clean aroma she could not quite place at first. It was earthy, damp, and carried a subtle sweetness. Then she recognized it, a scent she had only ever encountered in the fleeting moments after a rare rain. Pine. Tall, dark trees began to appear on the horizon, first as faint smudges, then growing into distinct shapes, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The horse's hooves now made a softer sound, no longer just crunching dust, but sometimes patting on patches of softer earth. Alara felt the subtle vibration through her body, a rhythm of movement that was both steady and reassuring. The whispers of the wind through the burgeoning pine forest began to reach her ears, a soft, continuous sigh that was utterly unlike the harsh, dry silence of the gulch. She remembered Silas's words about whispering pines, how the trees hummed. Now she understood. It was a sound of peace, a sound of secrets shared with the vast squee. Her little wooden doll, clutched tightly in her lap, felt like a bridge between her old life and this new one. Its familiar, smooth wood was a comfort, yet she felt a growing distance from the desperation it represented. The doll had been her only confidant, her silent witness to hunger and rejection. Now, with the pine scent filling her lungs and Silas's steady presence beside her, she felt less alone, less dependent on its quiet comfort. Perhaps she thought it might soon become a cherished memory, rather than a necessary companion. The ride continued for what felt like hours, though Alara had no real sense of time. The shifting light, the changing smells, the subtle sounds of the wilderness around them, all held her rapt. She watched a small rabbit dart across their path, its white tail a fleeting flash against the darkening undergrowth. A hawk circled high above, its call a sharp, clear note in the vast expanse. These were sights and sounds that had been hidden from her in the noisy, indifferent town. Here, life felt abundant, wild, and unfettered. A warmth spread through Alara's chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten how to recognize. It was not the fleeting warmth of a full stomach, but something deeper, more persistent. It was the warmth of possibility, of a new horizon stretching out before her, undefined and yet full of quiet promise. She could still feel the lingering ache in her limbs, the memory of hunger like a phantom limb, but it was being slowly, steadily pushed back by this new sensation. Her spirit, long starved, was beginning to unfurl. Silas finally broke the long silence. His voice was low, its gravelly tones softened by the evening air. Not much further now, Alara. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight of reassurance, a quiet confirmation that this journey had a destination, a purpose. Alara nodded, her throat suddenly tight with a mixture of anticipation and lingering apprehension. What would it truly be like, this place called Whispering Pines? Could it truly be as different as Silas had suggested? Just as the last vestiges of daylight began to drain from the sky, a clearing opened before them. The pines stood sentinel around the edges, their dark forms sharply outlined against the faint glow of the western horizon. And there, nestled within the clearing, was a sight that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. Whispering Pines Ranch. It was not grand, not ostentatious, but it was real, solid, and undeniably welcoming. A sturdy farmhouse stood bathed in the soft, fading light of twilight, its windows already spilling a warm, golden glow onto the surrounding yard. The air here was thick with the rich scent of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something subtly homely. Perhaps wood smoke or baking bread. Alara heard the distant lowing of a cow, the clucking of unseen chickens, and the ever-present, gentle hum of the wind through the tall trees. Silas reined in his horse, a quiet sigh escaping him as they came to a halt. Alara felt the sudden stillness, a profound quiet after the long ride. She looked at the sturdy house, its wooden walls a comforting, earthy brown. A small porch ran along the front, adorned with a simple wooden bench. Beyond the house, she could make out the faint outlines of fields, greener than any she had seen, and the dark shapes of what must be outbuildings. A clear stream glinted briefly in the last light, winding its way through the property. Silas dismounted first, his movements fluid despite the bandaged arm. He turned to Alara, his kind eyes reflecting the golden light from the farmhouse windows. With a gentle hand, he helped her slide down from the horse, his grip firm and steady. Alara's legs felt a little wobbly after the long ride, but the solid ground beneath her boots was a welcome sensation. She stood there, a small figure in a vast new landscape, her gaze sweeping over every detail of the ranch. The quiet, persistent hum of the pines seemed to wrap around her, a gentle embrace. It was a sound that promised peace, a stark contrast to the harsh, rattling winds of Dust Devil Gulch that had always carried the whispers of her abandonment. Here, the whispers felt benevolent, protective. She could almost feel the earth breathing beneath her feet, a slow, steady pulse of life. Her eyes drifted back to the farmhouse. The light spilling from its windows felt like an invitation, a beacon in the fading light. She imagined the warmth inside, the comfort of a solid roof, a hearth. It was everything she had yearned for, everything denied to her for so long. The stark reality of her past in Dust Devil Gulch, the cold, hard stares, the empty words, the gnawing hunger. All of it seemed to shrink, fading into a distant, unpleasant memory. A tremor ran through her, Not of fear, but of an emotion she was still learning to name. It felt like relief, like acceptance, like a deep internal thawing. The tightness in her chest, a constant companion for so long, began to loosen, allowing her to take a deeper, freer breath. The air, clean and cool, filled her lungs, tasting of pine and a hint of the approaching night. Silas stood beside her, giving her time, his presence a quiet reassurance. He did not rush her, did not speak, but simply allowed her to absorb the reality of this place. He understood, she realized, the magnitude of this moment for her. He understood that this was not just a new location, but a new world, a new beginning. His understanding was a comfort, a silent acknowledgement of her journey. Alara slowly lifted her gaze to the whispering trees, then to the sturdy house, then to the green fields that promised sustenance and life. The image of Martha Higgins's sneering face, the prospector's shove, the stable hand's averted eyes, all flashed through her mind, but they were distant, like ghosts on a receding tide. They no longer held the power to wound her. This place, this moment, was stronger. Her lips, usually chapped and drawn into a thin, anxious line, began to curve upwards. It was a slow, tentative movement, one she had not practiced in what felt like forever. A genuine smile, fragile yet utterly radiant, spread across her face, softening the haunted look in her wide blue eyes. It was a smile born not of fleeting joy, but of profound, quiet gratitude, of dawning hope. It felt unfamiliar, a muscle unused, but it was real. For the first time in memory, she truly smiled. Silas returned her smile, a gentle, knowing curve of his own lips. "Welcome home, Alara," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it resonated deeply within her. Home. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, a concept she had long since abandoned as a child's fantasy. But here it was, tangible and real, spoken by a man who had seen her at her lowest and offered her a hand up. The sound of it, the feeling of it, was almost overwhelming. She took a hesitant step forward, then another towards the farmhouse, towards the welcoming light. Each step felt solid, purposeful, unlike the aimless wandering of her past. Her tattered clothes, still clinging to her thin frame, felt less like a burden now, more like the shell of a life she was shedding. She carried the wooden doll, still, but its weight felt lighter, its significance transformed. It was no longer a symbol of her desolate existence, but a relic of a past endured, a testament to her survival. As they reached the small wooden porch, the warmth from inside enveloped her. The smell of hearth fire and something savory, perhaps a stew, drifted out, making her stomach rumble, but this time it was a healthy hunger, a natural response to the evening, not the desperate gnawing of starvation. She could hear the soft crackle of a fire, the gentle ticking of an unseen clock. Sounds of life and domesticity she had only ever heard from outside, through closed doors. Silas opened the door, a wave of warm air washing over them. The interior was simple but impeccably clean, filled with sturdy, well-worn furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire dancing within its grate. A braided rug covered the wooden floor, and a comfortable-looking armchair sat beside a small table laden with books. It was a place that spoke of quiet contentment, of honest labor, and of a life lived with purpose. Alara stepped inside, her small boots making almost no sound on the rug. Her eyes darted around, taking in the details. A wooden shelf filled with jars of preserves, a faded quilt draped over a chair, the faint scent of dried herbs. This was not the opulent luxury of the wealthy, but it was infinitely richer. It was a home full of quiet life, full of care. It was everything Dust Devil Gulch was not. She felt the residual grime of her past existence, the dirt on her hands, the weariness in her bones, but it no longer felt shameful. It was simply a part of her journey, a chapter closing as a new one began. The air here felt clean, not only physically, but metaphorically. It felt like a fresh slate, a blank page waiting for her story to be written anew. Silas gestured towards the armchair. "Make yourself comfortable, Alara. I'll see to the horse, then we can find you something to eat." His voice was gentle, his tone inviting, not commanding. He treated her not as a burden, not as a charity case, but as a guest, a valued presence. This simple respect was another unfamiliar, yet deeply nourishing sensation. Alara nodded, her voice still lost in the wonder of it all. She walked towards the armchair, her steps still a little hesitant, but her heart no longer pounding with fear. She carefully placed her wooden doll on the small table next to the chair, a small gesture of trust, a symbolic handover of her past self to this new reality. The doll seemed to watch her, its faded painted eyes reflecting the firelight, as if it too understood the profound shift. She sank into the armchair, the soft cushions a luxurious embrace against her tired body. The warmth of the fire radiated towards her, chasing away the last lingering chill from the evening air. She stretched her fingers, feeling the subtle ache in her muscles, but it was an ache of effort, of distance traveled, not of desperation. Her gaze fell upon the books on the table, their spines worn from use. Perhaps she thought she might even learn to read here. The thought brought another quiet smile to her lips. A sense of profound peace settled over her, deeper and more complete than anything she had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of hunger, or the warmth of the fire, or the soft comfort of the chair. It was the absence of fear, the absence of judgment, the absence of the constant, gnawing worry for her very existence. It was the quiet, unwavering presence of kindness, of a future that held promise rather than dread. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sensations wash over her. The smell of wood smoke, the crackle of the fire, the distant sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, the steady beat of her own heart. No longer a frantic drum of fear, but a calm, steady rhythm of life. A single tear, this one not of sorrow or pain, but of overwhelming gratitude, traced a warm path down her cheek. It was a release, a silent acknowledgement of all she had endured and all she had found. As she opened her eyes, the farmhouse felt less like a new place and more like an old friend, a place she was meant to be all along. The sturdy walls, the simple furnishings, the warm light, all spoke of permanence, of belonging. She was not just a guest here, she was part of it. Silas had not just offered her a meal, he had offered her a world. Alara knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, a feeling as solid and real as the ground beneath the ranch house, that her starving days were finally over. That desperate, constant ache, that relentless fear of the next meal, the next rejection, had truly ended. A life she never dared to dream of, a life filled with quiet warmth and gentle promise, had finally begun. What would you have done? One line in the comments. Let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.